we got to get to Geno Smith because otherwise people are just going to tune us out because
Yeah.
that was our big topic. One of our big topics last week was the future of Geno Smith. And I don't know, did I put this on the list? Who was supposed to bring this up? Oh, it was me again. So I'm cutting the line. I'm cutting. You know why I'm cutting it. We'll reference it when we bring it back because we are going to bring it back. But Geno Smith ends up, the Seahawks keep him around past the deadline where his injury guarantee kicks in, and they're on the hook for somebody is going to be on the hook for like an extra $9 million.
12 mil. It's around 12 mil is what he's guaranteed.
Oh yeah, it's $9 million is the roster bonus on March 18th or whatever.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So
the now there's like basically to simplify these deadlines is now that this injury guarantee has come across, the Seahawks will not release Geno Smith. This was essentially the deadline to release Geno Smith, and then the March 18th one, I believe, would be the deadline to trade Geno Smith. If he's still around after the roster bonus, there's a very strong chance he will be the Seahawks starting quarterback because trading him would mean essentially neutral salary. And the big reason to get rid of Geno Smith isn't just because isn't just performance or even performance at all. It's salary cap relief. And so my question for you is, what do you think the chances are now? Obviously they're higher than they were, that Geno Smith is the starting quarterback week 1, 2024, barring injuries. Do you view there being a possibility of a trade?
I'd say there is still a possibility of a trade. I think at this point, it's probably like 85% he's the starting quarterback.
I could go with that.
Basically, the Seahawks guaranteed him $12 million last week. And like you said, March 18th, another $9 million-ish kicks in.
Well, but the difference though, just to be clear, is that if the Seahawks trade him, the team that he goes to would pay him the $12 million, where that roster bonus, if the Seahawks are the ones that pay the roster bonus, they're the ones that pay the roster bonus.
Right. So, no, I mean, I think it certainly dramatically increases the probability of him being the starter. I think I did see a number of articles when Geno and the Seahawks, basically agreed for him to stick around last week, making very decisive claims about what this meant. Now, I think the Seahawks view this decision as an investment in some ways, because I think their thought is $12 million for a starting caliber quarterback is kind of a bargain in today's market. So that still allows them the possibility to explore trade options. If someone were to come calling and say, hey, we need a quarterback, and we see you have this guy who's only going to cost us 12 mil, that's a pretty good price for a stopgap, right? That's kind of offensive to Geno. They might not view him as a stopgap, but the reality is that's probably what a different team would probably see him as, right? So, I think the Seahawks think they still have all options at their disposal, and that this was basically a nothing. This was a given. It was always going to happen where they were going to guarantee this 12 mil. And the bigger deadline is probably that March 18th deadline where you have to decide if he's going to be on your roster or not. Now, I believe that deadline's like 5 days after the new year starts. So 5 days into free agency. Obviously the draft hasn't taken place then, but after that free agency period starts, you usually have a little bit more clarity on any team's roster. Do I think that they're realistically going to get a trade offer for Geno Smith? Probably not. I mean, there's not a lot of teams out there that need a quarterback. And because you're talking about a deadline that occurs before the draft with all the quarterbacks available in the draft, I mean, you would have to be looking at a team that wanted to maybe draft a quarterback, but sit him for a year or two, which the Seahawks could conceivably be in that camp as well.
Well, it's interesting because I think it's not just the team that wants to sit him or sit the rookie for a couple of years, but also a team that is interested in winning now, because you're not going to be paying him like backup money. You're still going to be paying him. It's low end starter money, but So yes, I agree with you on that. I think that the teams that make sense are like, if Tennessee decides that they want Will Levis to sit, I think Minnesota would make a lot of sense if Kirk Cousins goes elsewhere. Maybe the Raiders, if the Raiders, I don't think they believe in Aiden O'Connell as the starter. It looks like they're going to cut Jimmy Garoppolo. And By the way, Jimmy Garoppolo, a guy that a lot of Seahawks fans, including myself, wanted the Seahawks to end up with a couple years ago when he seemed like the odd man out in San Francisco. Like the
Jimmy Garoppolo got busted for PEDs, and I was just
yeah.
like, he needs to get a refund, man. They
so
were
so
drugs, but not performance enhancing.
yeah, I mean, who like what other team? I guess like whatever happens in
Chicago.
Tampa Bay, Chicago is interesting
Chicago's
for
interesting. Yeah,
they're
I think.
interesting for both Drew Lock and Geno Smith. I think
Right.
the problem with Chicago is because of where Justin Fields is at in his contract, it they either are going to decide they're not going to keep Justin Fields on the roster and bench him. Like that's just not a realistic
Yeah, but
thing for them to do.
what could happen with Chicago is they decide they either want to they want to cut ties with Justin Fields in some capacity, right?
Sure.
And in doing so, they still have the number 1 overall draft pick, which they could use on a quarterback. Maybe they don't think that guy is ready to start day one. It seems unlikely. They could also potentially get rid of Justin Fields and trade down from number 1. I mean, these are all
Sure.
things that could happen. And obviously, with Shane Waldron over there now, who's coached both Geno Smith and Drew Lock, he has a familiarity there. So if they decided to go in a different direction than what they have, I mean, there's some potential with Geno there. But it just seems most likely that Geno Smith is a starter on the Seahawks next season. And who knows where that leaves Drew Lock? I mean, if you have Geno Smith and you conceivably go draft a guy at quarterback, then you certainly don't have a need for Drew Lock. And that probably means he goes elsewhere as a free agent. But
Well, that assumes you draft a guy, though. But of course, like we're talking about,
right.
the league year is going to start. I mean, I think there's going to be a delicate thing because I think the advantage of Drew Lock is only if you can sign him at a contract with a similar annual average value to what he was making as a backup. If you're going to sign him to Geno Smith money, keep Geno Smith. That's like I definitely to me.
I don't think. No, go ahead.
To me, I understand the argument, and I kind of agree with the argument that I think that he and Geno Smith have a similar skill level, and so having said that, I think it makes sense to me that you would just let's just keep the cheapest one, because let's say you go draft a quarterback, the advantage of having a young quarterback is you get $40 million in cap space for those years that he's on his rookie deal to use on defense and skill position players and maybe front load some contracts of guys that you want to stick around past that rookie contract and you want the guarantees to fall off a little bit towards the end of their careers. Like you get a lot of cap flexibility and the ability to really exploit that extra cap space, but you don't get that if you have a guy making $30 million against the cap in Geno Smith on the roster.
Yeah, I think it's always been weird how much the Seahawks value both those guys compared to presumably the rest of the league, I would say. Obviously, the narrative on Geno has changed a lot since he came to Seattle and took over the starting job. I mean, the narrative on Geno prior to that was like decent, reliable backup and pretty much a punchline as a starter. And he changed that. He changed that narrative entirely. Not only did he change it on the field with his play, but I think the intangibles of Geno Smith are really undervalued by most fans. I think the perception of Geno Smith is that he's kind of a joke because that's what he was when he was in New York, when he got drafted, throughout much of his career. But when you listen to this guy talk, I mean, he's really well spoken. He's thoughtful. He's smart. I understand he's had some off field transgressions. We all know that. But he's a pretty thoughtful guy. And I think he goes beyond the typical quarterback as far as what he can do beyond just his play on the field. I mean, he's been a leader in the community. He seems to say all the right things. He seems like a pretty good person. He seems to have the locker room in his grasp. I mean, most of the guys really go to bat for Geno. And I think those are characteristics that the Seahawks have always valued quite a bit. I think that's part of the reason why they ultimately cut ties with some of the guys they did. They let Earl Thomas go. They let Russell Wilson walk away. I mean, in a trade, but they basically decided to part with some of these guys because they maybe didn't have all those intangibles, even though they are great players on the field. So the characteristics that Geno has, the team really, really seems to value. And that's not to say that someone like Drew Lock doesn't have those characteristics or somebody else entirely out there. But, it's a bad expression, but the devil versus the devil you don't. I mean, in this case, it's a positive. What you have in Geno, and it's pretty good. So to just move on from that would be hasty without any kind of contingency plan in place. And I think when it comes to the draft, I'm sure the Seahawks have some guys in mind that they like. They'll always be rumored to Michael Penix now that Ryan Grubb's there. But the reality is you just don't know if you can get that guy at the value that you want, right? Like, let's say there's a run on quarterbacks at the top of the draft before the Seahawks even get to their pick. They're in trouble. There's not a whole lot that they can do at that point. They don't have a ton of flexibility to move up that far. And they're a team that wants to win now. So you're not gonna waste capital on overreaching for a quarterback if that quarterback doesn't provide the value that you need at the slot that you're drafting him. So a lot to consider. They are in a very unique place because they are a team that seems to be kind of, in a way, rebuilding at the quarterback position while also trying to win now. They're like one of maybe 2 or 3 teams that are in that position. It's very unique.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they seem like, I mean, kind of, I think that's a good point. I think that there's a good chance that if they were, I'm going to name you the teams that I think make some sense, and we can debate or not debate, but if they were one of these teams, you would think they might be in the market to trade for a guy like Geno Smith. I think the argument that I have and that a lot of people have is that they kind of have 2 versions of Geno Smith on the roster, or not on the roster as of, I think, a couple days ago, but Drew Lock seems to be a guy who they could bring back relatively easily. Maybe that's wrong, but to come back last year as a backup and a guy that's been praised by the coaching staff over and over again and by John Schneider over and over again. So these are the teams that I think, anyway. Minnesota, 7-10 last year. Kirk Cousins is a free agent. They're like kind of at the point. They were like trying to win last year. They had some really good stretches before Kirk Cousins was injured. They also had some really bad luck and maybe some just like Kirk Cousins isn't the guy moments. Chicago 7-10 also, which I think we forget because they also have the number 1 overall pick. So but that's a Carolina pick. Tampa Bay, if they don't keep Baker Mayfield. Atlanta, if they don't, depending on what they do. I mean, there's like a bunch of rumors what they might do. And then I think maybe the most interesting ones to me are Denver, who will probably never make a trade with Seattle again. Tennessee is an option, and Pittsburgh is an option. And then I'm going to read you the Pro Football Focus top quarterback free agents because the drop-off is harsh. It's steep. Kirk Cousins, number 2 overall Pro Football Focus free agent. He is the number 1 quarterback on their board. Number 2, free agent quarterback. Can you guess who Pro Football Focus has, who is not using... and you'll know this, especially when we see it, they're not using their projected contract value as a ranking. It's their evaluation. But who do you think is number 2?
Drew Lock. No, I have no idea.
No, it's Ryan Tannehill.
Okay, yeah,
Ryan Tannehill, Baker Mayfield, Gardner Minshew, Jacoby Brissett, Jameis Winston. I don't even know if the league has to have that high of an opinion to have a higher opinion of Geno Smith than the rest of those guys. And even if it is a good draft for quarterbacks, there's 6 legit like first or second round type of quarterbacks this year, it seems like. And then there's some other guys that you might be able to tilt your head and see, because we're going to talk a lot about the draft, Alex, as it comes up. And
yeah,
I'm excited about it, especially because the Seahawks have a first
more
round.
than you. Yeah,
I love the draft. But to me, there's going to be a lot of teams that want to go the Patrick Mahomes route, that want to have a guy sit behind a veteran. And so it's possible that you and I, because I'm not putting this on you completely. You said you didn't think you could get a 7th round pick for Geno Smith last week. My opinion of that might be slightly different. I might be slightly higher on his trade value than you are, but I was not very high. But in the immediate aftermath of him being pushed through this deadline, Adam Schefter was including trade as an option for Geno Smith.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a market for him if somebody wants to pay up, right? But the quarterbacks that you listed that are free agents, they're like the definition of the 1-year stopgap quarterback. I mean,
right.
I get Kirk Cousins has been entrenched in Minnesota for a few years, but I think the rest of his career is as a hired gun.
But some of those teams want more than a stopgap because they are actually on the verge of the playoffs.
Yeah,
all those teams I mentioned were like in playoff contention.
Right. I mean, the NFL, it always surprises me which type of guys the NFL values. Like when Derek Carr got the contract he got last year from New Orleans, it's like, if you were just a fan and you looked at Derek Carr as a fan, you would know that contract was bad. But there has to be some, and I think part of it is like some of these guys who have the intangibles, like that's something that fans often don't see. Like maybe if it's your guy, you understand what their intangibles are. But I think in football circles in the NFL, if a guy is a really good speaker in a room, if he can captivate the locker room, if he can sell himself on a ownership group and a coaching staff and a front office, to them that's like invaluable. And so you see some of these quarterbacks that aren't very good get those big contracts because they can convince the right people in the room that they're worth it, or maybe they just have a great agent who's going to go and sell that guy. Either way, there's something there that allows these guys to keep getting chances when you can tell that they're just not like that great. There's nothing
Sure.
compelling about Derek Carr. So I think the Seahawks see all those things that like a lot of those teams see in guys like Derek Carr, for example. They see that in Geno Smith, but probably to another degree. I mean, they really seem to value him as a starter. And that's where it just gets, you just never know. I mean, I think the perspective of fans is that, oh, if they can get something for Geno, they'll trade him. But for all we know, the Seahawks have no intention of trading Geno Smith.
Yeah,
Whether
that's
they
absolutely
intend to,
possible.
yeah, whether they intend to draft somebody or not is one thing. But separate from that, I mean, they might see the contract that they signed Geno Smith to last year, and in their minds, that was always going to be fulfilled all the way through. And really, I mean, if you look at his season last year, there's no reason to think that the fulfillment of the contract would be like bad for either party, for the
Sure.
Seahawks or for Geno. I mean, they got exactly what they paid for last year, in my opinion. I mean, he was worse than the year prior, but the year prior, he was such an unexpected surprise that he really exceeded all expectations and earned the contract that he got. The contract, and we talked about this last year. I mean, the contract that he got at the time was beneficial for all, the team and for him. And
Well,
so,
and I mean, even the fact that they're in this position to possibly be able to trade him, or they could have gotten out of the contract, and next year they could get out like pretty easily and save a whole bunch of cap space. It remains beneficial for the Seahawks. I get how it's like everybody keeps bringing up this thing like, well, the Seahawks view him as a bargain. Well, it's like, yeah, fine, but he's a bargain to every other team too. Like I agree that he's a bargain, but it's also I will say this: if they keep Geno Smith and they re-sign Drew Lock, about half of the teams in the NFL carried 3 quarterbacks last year, and the rest of them carried 2. What I would say is, to me, that changes the round you start looking at quarterbacks for me to be happy. And that means like it's probably like 4th round and later. If they're going to have both those guys on the roster, then I don't really want those guys blocking Michael Penix or JJ McCarthy or Bo Nix or somebody like that. Or even like if you have to draft him with one of the 2 third-round picks, like a Spencer Rattler or I'm a big I like Joe Milton, who you might be able to get later, but those guys that you have to draft early with, and especially because this defense is full of holes, and so if you're gonna draft that guy, I'd like a clearer path to the starting job than like you have to get through Geno Smith and Drew Lock as like the 2. That's like the bosses on an unlicensed Christian Nintendo game. You know what I mean? I don't know if you ever played any of those.
Not the unlicensed, only the licensed. I'm a rule stickler. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the Seahawks, granted, it's a whole new regime, more or less. I mean, John Schneider's still there, but they've very rarely carried 3 quarterbacks, and they certainly haven't carried a 3rd quarterback that had any sort of prestige. So, I mean, if you are going to go 3 quarterbacks, I mean, it's probably not going to be one of those big name guys in the draft that everyone's thinking of. But at the same time, I mean, this is another, you get all this hype around these quarterbacks. Like, let's take Michael Penix, for example. I mean, throughout the season, Michael Penix's draft stock skyrocketed because the Huskies were winning and he was playing very well. In NFL circles, he might not be as highly rated as we all think. I know that there's a lot of draft experts out there who say, okay, he might have found his way into the 1st round or early 2nd, but he does still have an injury history. He played behind like an impenetrable line at Washington. Sure. I'm not trying to like downgrade. No one gives a shit what I think, so I'm not trying to downgrade this guy's stock. I love Michael Penix, but the reality is he played behind a line that more or less kept him untouched. And that's probably not going to be the case in the NFL. These hits he's going to take in the NFL are going to be harder. He's probably going to be playing behind a line that gives up more penetration than the Huskies did.
I would like to spend a large portion of an episode talking, because we're in this lull where it's like, do we talk about the NBA that I don't watch at this time, though there may be some advancements on me resuming viewership of the NBA in the next couple of years, which I want to talk about that at some point this offseason also. I want to talk about all the Huskies because I've been wanting to talk about Jack Westover since the Michigan game, and I had him as a topic either on our sheet or in my mind to talk about, and never brought it up because and we should find maybe find a guest that already has a podcast and a microphone and better internet than Roger Lazola and get them to come on to talk about the Huskies players because I would love to because I'm with you. Like I love Michael Penix. I think he's got a lot of skills that NFL teams covet and that excel in the NFL. But yeah, I'd be curious to see what somebody else says because I love him, but that doesn't mean that everyone loves him or that he would be loved universally.
Yeah, I think it's just going to be an interesting draft because there's so many quarterbacks and there's just not a ton of quarterback needy teams. And it's going to make, every year you see some guys fall down the draft board that you never expect. I mean, the Seahawks have been the benefactor of that with DK Metcalf in the past. And it's possible, if they can find one of these guys in the 3rd or 4th round who has a pretty big name, they might just take him even if they already do have those 2 quarterbacks on the roster. You might be right about that. I think the thing about the Seahawks is they're always willing. They have a pretty good idea of what they want to do, but they're always willing to stray from that if it makes more sense to stray. I think that's what separates them from a lot of orgs out there. I mean, a lot of orgs are going to reach to get the guy that they want or trade up to get the guy that they want, no matter what. And that can really hurt. Sometimes it pays dividends and sometimes it can really hurt you. The Seahawks are like, we have a plan and we may or may not stick to it, but we'll just kind of let the market dictate what we do.
Yeah, and I like that. I like that they go best player available most of the time. That's my preference, and I like the idea of having flexibility. Unfortunately, your back's against the wall a little bit with Geno Smith before the draft. You have to make a decision on Geno before the draft. If there's interest in the market, you're going to have to make a decision on Drew Lock before the draft, probably. And so, I guess to me, like in an ideal world, you'd have a starter in waiting, get something of value for Geno Smith, and have Drew Lock there to on a 2-year deal so that if he pops, a guy who's spent a couple years in Seattle that they're very familiar with, if he pops, you can maybe get a couple picks or a pick for him also. Or I think the other thing about Drew Lock is if he does somehow realize the potential that a lot of people thought he had on draft day, and some people still hold out, are still holding the candle out that he might have it, then you have another guy who's like a potentially the starter of the future, or at least the short-term future. And I just think there's not you can't. John Schneider started his time in Seattle by saying he wanted to take a quarterback every year, and he took Alex Magoo and Russell Wilson, and Russell Wilson obviously was a home run 3rd-round pick. There's no arguments about that. And I hope that what we find out is that Pete Carroll, the guy who's not here anymore, is the guy who was stopping him from taking swings at quarterbacks.
Yeah, and the offensive coordinator turnover. I mean, they were bringing new OCs in all the time, so that just really dictates who you're going to draft a lot of times. If you don't have that big voice in the room from an offensive standpoint who's standing up for a quarterback or whoever they want to take, it's going to be very hard to draft those guys as a result. The defensive voices are going to take over, and that's what happened under Pete. Man, Alex Magoo. Unfortunate name. There's just certain guys that as athletes, when you hear their name, you're like, boy, I don't think things are going to work out the way that guy hopes.
Yeah, Mr. Magoo's having a tough time as a quarterback. What I would say is he had every opportunity to not pronounce it Magoo because it looked like Magow or McGuff or something like that, depending on how you...
Yes, I actually know. I went to school with some people that had that last name, and they did not pronounce it Magoo. So, you have some control there that you've chosen not to take.
Yeah, your family, your ancestors have fucked you, is what's going on.
They made a terrible decision.